Hello everyone, welcome to another Quad Education Test Prep Fundamentals video. My name is Tom, and today we are talking about, by far, the most important punctuation mark you need to understand to be successful at the ACT English and SAT writing sections. That punctuation mark, as I'm sure you've guessed, is the comma. So let's take a look. Okay, let's talk about commas. So I will go ahead and say that the majority of information out there about commas is misinformation. It's wrong. And I cannot tell you how many times I've had an AP Literature, AP Lang student, a regular track English student who has no idea what commas actually do. It's one of those things that you could even call it a failing of the education system, the fact that we don't know how to use this punctuation mark that we use almost more than any other punctuation mark. I'd say after periods, commas would be the second most frequently used punctuation mark, and we don't know what they're for. This video, I will cover the basics of it, the definition, and the most frequently occurring comma questions you'll see, and hopefully that will not only make you better at this test, but also a better writer. So first of all, a reminder on clauses. One of our first videos was about clauses. Hopefully our production value is slightly increased since then, but please go give that video a watch, because understanding clauses will be integral to understanding when you use and do not use a comma. So once you come back from that, we can continue on. So just a quick review of those. Independent clause, which I'm just going to denote as the letter I from now on, is a complete thought. It has a subject and a verb and usually an object. And a dependent clause is an incomplete thought, which is to say that it's either missing a subject, missing a verb, or missing both, or has something in front of the subject and the verb to make it incomplete. And now the million-dollar question. What are commas for? What do they do? And I'll give you a second to think to yourself, and then I'll let you know. And I will first of all say, if you said that the comma was for a pause, that is not what it is for. I'm sorry to say, unless you're in a play or in poetry, a comma, in this case, specifically in academic writing, is not for a pause. I like to say that a pause doesn't really mean anything. I suppose if there's a specific punctuation mark for a pause, it would be a space. But other than that, I will say that a comma is not for a pause. The comma has exactly two functions. The first function, we'll go for the most readily available one first, is for listing. So before anything else, yeah, commas make lists. And the second thing that commas do is they separate clauses, which is why we need so much to understand what an independent and a dependent clause is, respectively. And this helps us to understand that all commas do is indicate where one clause ends and another one begins. So two uses, can't say it enough, listing and separating clauses. And as always, we're going to go for the easier topic first, and the easier topic between those two uses for commas is certainly the list rule. So a list is more than two things. So I think everybody kind of knows that two things, A comma and B, is not good. So for example, if I said bread comma and cheese, you would recognize that that's not a good use of a comma. However, if I said something like bread, cheese, and milk, you would recognize that those commas are good and that there should be commas there, because that is three things in a list. Those are three things in a list. And now moving on to the more involved rule. So the clause separation rule. There are a couple of rules here, so this will probably be the rest of the lesson we talk about this. So the first thing we need to figure out with clause separation is which kinds of clauses can we separate with commas. And so I put a lot of question marks here to see whether or not you think that we can do this. So the first one here is a dependent clause, a comma, and then an independent clause. Do you think it's okay to have a comma between a dependent clause and an independent clause in a sentence? Well, yes, you can. So for example, I'll say, while I walk to school, I listen to music. And that's a perfectly acceptable sentence right there. How about an independent clause, a comma, then a dependent clause? Well, yes, that's also fine. Something like, I walk to school even if it's cold. So nothing wrong with that. Well, what about dependent, comma, independent, comma, dependent? Is that all right? Yes, that's also okay. So that'd be something like, while I walk to school, I listen to music, even though I'd prefer to be driven. So nothing wrong with that sentence either. And then what about dependent, comma, dependent, comma, dependent, comma, dependent, comma, dependent, comma, independent, comma, dependent. Well, that's actually just fine as well. I'm not going to write this example, but it'd be something like, while walking to school, listening to music, looking for birds, trying to stay focused. Even though it was cold, I saw my friends who were similarly chilly. And although that is obnoxious, that is not technically incorrect. And technically incorrect to correct is the entire point of this test. Which brings me to a really important point before we move on to I, comma I and D, comma D, which is how long can a sentence be? And the answer to that is, I don't care. There is no limit. So when we're in elementary school and junior high school, what we hear a lot is from a teacher is this sentence is too long or this sentence is too short. And when you're younger and earlier in your academic careers, maybe this is acceptable because you don't have the technical vocabulary to understand why something is incorrect or not. And so the teacher just says too long or too short. But now that we are in high school and on our way to college, we need to be more technically minded, and length is no longer a consideration for technical correctness. Instead, now it's going to be, does it have a subject? Does it have a verb? And the point of illustrating this here is to say that it doesn't matter how long it is. All it matters is whether or not it breaks any of the rules that we outline. And speaking of breaking rules, I, comma I right here, that is a run-on sentence. So something like, I walk to school, comma, I listen to music. This is a run-on sentence. This is two sentences. And so what we need to remember here is the biggest mistake that we can see in punctuation with commas is I, comma I. This is never going to work. And you can see here that Microsoft Word is trying to tell me that I've made a comma splice, and I know that. And finally, we have dependent, comma, dependent. Is that all right? Well, that also has a name, and that is a fragment. So do something like walking to school, listening to music. And we can see that nothing happens here, and so this won't work either. So big takeaway from this is I, comma I, incorrect, D, comma D, also incorrect. And moving on, I'm just going to have that up there, just that big important rule, I, comma I is the worst error that you can make with punctuation. So next question here is, do we think it's okay to have a comma between a subject and a verb? Well, no, we don't like that, because it'd be something like I, comma, walk to school, which doesn't make sense. And then our next question would be, is it a good idea to have a comma between a verb and an object in a sentence? And I don't think that makes a ton of sense either. There'd be something like I, comma, there'd be something like I walk, comma, to school, which sort of just splits that up in such a way that really breaks the meaning of the sentence. So something like I walk would make sense by itself because that's subject and a verb. But then to school, we might think to ourselves, like, what do you mean to school? To school? To school? What is the purpose of this clause now? So no comma between a subject and a verb, no comma between a verb and an object. Okay, second to last big rule here is appositive. So for whatever reason, the SAT and the ACT just love this rule. I'm not entirely sure why. I think maybe it's because they have some really interesting ways that they can test this topic, but you will absolutely see a ton of appositive questions on the test that you take. And what an appositive is basically just a dependent clause inserted into the middle of an independent clause. So my example here for you says, my manager, who used to be in the Air Force, is moving to Utah. So I would ask you, do you need to be in the Air Force in order to move to Utah? And the answer is obviously no. And what you can do with these appositives is just take them out. And very easily you could say, my manager is moving to Utah, and that would make complete sense. So that is the test for appositives. Can we get rid of this thing? And if we can, then it's an appositive and we need to surround it with commas. If we cannot, if taking out this series of words changes the meaning of the sentence, then we cannot surround it with commas. And then finally for today, we have title, comma, holder rule. So our first example there, Dr. comma Phil is here. You can pretty clearly see that this comma right here is really bad because we have this comma next to a period, and that's just not something that we would do. And I've made this clear example here, and in contrast made this less clear example here. Straight-A student and high school skating team captain April Rogers is here. So I think that if you put this comma right here, people would not notice. It makes tons of sense to most people because we have all these words and then April Rogers. And what is actually going on is this is also a title. So probably important to define a title for now. A title is anything someone is or does. And so in the first example, we have doctor, which is what this person is. And then we have straight-A student and high school skating team captain, which is what April is. And I suppose it's also what she does. And so if you have any example of this is or does thing, title could be Mr., Dr., Mrs., anything like that, but also something longer like this, we cannot separate the title from the title holder. And so that's it for the rules today. We're going to go into some example problems now. This is not all the comma questions that you'll see. In the future, I'll do a more involved comma video with a couple more of the more esoteric, like the less frequently occurring and more challenging comma questions. But for now, this is just a primer of the hits, the ones that you'll see the most frequently. Okay, here's our first practice problem. We've got 2 for today. See how this one goes. Okay, let's take a look. Employees whose tuition is reimbursed often stay with their employer even after they complete their degrees because their new qualifications give them opportunities for advancement within the company. And we want to know whether or not we want this comma right here. And right away, we can tell that this is a subject, comma, verb error. So as I mentioned, we cannot do that. So we do not like that option right there. And then this option right here is giving you often stay as what looks like an appositive. And let's see if we can read without often stay. Employees whose tuition is reimbursed with their employer even after they complete their degrees. No, that's not going to make sense because this is going to have to be our independent clause. We can say this clause here begins with because, so it is dependent. And so we're going to need to have an independent clause to the left of that comma. So taking our verb out is not going to work. Then we have the choice between often stay and often stay with a comma there. I would say this is more of a comma between a verb and an object, which we also don't like. And so we're left with no comma. And so lots of words without commas until this comma clause right there. But that's fine because we cannot put a comma between a subject and a verb. And I will say that effectively graffitiing all over a question like this is exactly how you should be solving questions on the test. If you're trying to do these in your head, it's going to be much more difficult and there's going to be mistakes that you don't see. Okay, next one here, see how this one goes. Okay, let's take a look. The 6 rare tropical birds were transported to the University of Delaware, where tropical bird and exotic raptor specialist James Jones inspected them for bloodborne illness. And we have James Jones as an appositive here. And so let's read without James Jones, where tropical bird and exotic raptor specialist inspected them for bloodborne illness. And that doesn't quite work, does it? That doesn't really make sense. Maybe if we said where a tropical or where the tropical bird specialist inspected them, but we don't have that the there, so it can't work. And so we'll say, no, this is not an appositive, so I do not like that. And then what we have here for B is a title, comma, holder error, because James Jones' title is tropical bird and exotic raptor specialist, which does sound like a pretty cool job. And so we cannot do that. And have to decide whether or not we want a comma after. And this is also going to be a verb, comma, object error, so we have to get rid of that, which leaves us with C. Okay, that's it for this video. Remember that commas only serve 2 purposes. Those 2 purposes being listing and separating clauses. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. In the future, we may do a more esoteric comma use video, but today's covered the basics. So if you found this material useful, we hope that you will like and share the video and subscribe to Quiet Education. If you require any tutoring, please be sure to reach out to us. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.